ranking the greatest MLB players of all time.
In general, I've never been satisfied with any all-time ranking. The one that really caught my attention was the one done by ESPN that had way too many black and white photos toward the top of the list. I admit it's super difficult to do an all-time ranking of baseball because professional baseball has existed since the 1800s. However, in today's video, I'm going to do my absolute best by including a good mix of players throughout MLB history. In particular, though, I will say I lean towards more recent players, as I think the level of competition has definitely increased over time, and the color barrier existed in Major League Baseball until 1947, and the sport's become a lot more international. And like in most sports, I think it's fair to say that the players get better over time. I tried my absolute best to balance this list, and I did look at adjusted numbers to help. In this video, instead of doing one comprehensive list, I'm going to do the top 10 by position, and there are no players that played the majority of their career during the 1800s, as the American League wasn't established until 1901. If you like today's video, I'm releasing baseball content all the time. Drop a like, and let's see how I do here. I know some people won't be happy with this list, but I promise I did my best to try to celebrate Major League Baseball history. Starting off at the catcher position. At 10, I've got Buster Posey. While his career was on the short side, he was amazing. He won Rookie of the Year, he won an MVP, he won 3 World Series. He's undoubtedly one of the greatest hitting catchers of all time. He had an incredible peak, everything that you would want from a catcher. Just ahead of him in the 9th spot, I have Joe Mauer. In 2009, Joe Mauer put together one of the greatest seasons ever by a catcher. He was also a very good defensive catcher. The only thing that really goes against him is that he wasn't a catcher for long. And when he moved to first base, he wasn't a very good hitter anymore. At 8, Roy Campanella. Due to the color barrier, we didn't see him in Major League Baseball until the late 1940s. And by that time, he was already in his age 26 season. However, from that time onward, he was incredible. He won the MVP award 3 different times. And in 4 different seasons, he hit 30-plus home runs. He was also part of the 1955 World Series winning Brooklyn Dodgers. At 7, Carlton Fisk. At the time of his retirement, he had the most all-time home runs ever by a catcher. He was one of the better hitting catchers in the league for a very long time. And he had at least 1 All-Star appearance in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. At 6, Mike Piazza. When you think of the all-time great hitting catchers, you definitely think about Mike Piazza. Was he great defensively? No. But his offensive numbers are outrageous for a catcher. To put this in perspective, his career OPS plus of 143 is better than Miguel Cabrera. Yeah, he was that good of a hitter. Unfortunately, though, his defense wasn't great, and for a position where defense is so important, I can't put him any higher than this. At 5, Gary Carter. Pretty much everything you would want from a catcher. A great hitter, a great defender, and he was very good for a long time, which is why his career WAR over 70 is one of the best of all time at the position. He was also a World Series winner on the 1986 Mets. Just ahead of him in the 4th spot, Yogi Berra, one of the most accomplished catchers in Major League history, a 3-time MVP, and a ridiculous 10-time World Series winner. He's also right up there on the all-time list of most home runs by a catcher, and he was number 1 at the time of his retirement. Just ahead of him in the 3rd spot, Ivan Rodriguez. Originally, I had Yogi Berra ahead of him, but if you actually look at their numbers, Ivan Rodriguez at his peak was basically just as good of a hitter as Yogi Berra, if not even a little bit better. He did it more recently. But on top of that, he's also one of the greatest defensive catchers of all time, winning the Gold Glove 13 times. I think people forget how good he was because he held on for such a long time, but at his peak, he was truly incredible, and right there in discussion for greatest catcher of all time. However, ahead of him, I have Johnny Bench at 2. When you think about the most well-rounded catcher in Major League history, it's hard to look past Johnny Bench. And he has the highest WAR all time by a catcher. He also won 10 Gold Gloves, as he was a great defender, and he won 2 MVPs, and he won 2 World Series. At his peak, he was definitely in discussion for best player in MLB. But just ahead of him in the 1 spot, I'm going with Josh Gibson. Due to the color barrier, we don't have all Josh Gibson's stats. However, of the stats that we do have, he was one of the greatest hitters in baseball history. And the fact that he did this as a primary catcher is ridiculous. When I set out to make this video, I knew there would be some players who played a long time ago who were going to appear pretty high on this list. And Josh Gibson was definitely one of those. Because at the end of the day, how you play against your peers is largely what this list is based off of. And though maybe he didn't play the all-time best competition, anyone that he ever played, including MLB players at the time, he dominated. He has the highest batting average in history and the highest slugging percentage in history. The way I look at it is he was like Babe Ruth as a hitter, but he was also a catcher. So it's hard not to put him at number 1 on this list, as many people of the day considered him to be the greatest player at the time. Next, we move on to first base. In the 10th spot, I'm going with Mark McGwire. One thing that was very important to me on this list was to consider all players, even if they took the juice. Because at the end of the day, during the era that these players played in, most of the players were probably doing it. And because we don't know exactly who did and didn't take them at the time, I consider all players. You want to skip past number 10 because you think that all players who took juice should be off this list? That's okay. I understand it. You want to put an asterisk? I understand it. But at the end of the day, I'm considering all players based on the information that I have available. And to me, Mark McGwire was undoubtedly one of the greatest first basemen of his generation. In the entire history of Major League Baseball, no player has a better at-bat per home run than Mark McGwire, which is why he put together a ridiculous stretch of 4 straight seasons with 50-plus home runs, including a 65 home home run season and a 70 home run season. And his career 163 OPS plus means he was more than just a home run hitter. At his peak, he was a very good overall hitter with great plate discipline. At 9, Harmon Killebrew, another all-time great home run hitter. He led the league in home runs 8 different times throughout his career. In the 8th spot, Jim Thome. He had over 600 career home runs with a 147 career OPS plus. He was also my favorite player of all time. A 400 on base percentage with an over 500 slugging percentage with over 600 home runs. That's pretty elite company. And I value both peak and longevity. If you had an incredible peak, that's awesome. But if you also were really good for a very long time, to me, that's equally as awesome, just in a different way. And Jim Thome was one of the better hitters in baseball for a very long time. Just ahead of him in the 7th spot, Willie McCovey, another all-time great power hitter, member of the 500 Home Run Club, and also won an MVP award. McCovey Cove got its name from him. At 6, Jeff Bagwell. Honestly, kind of an underrated career. He was basically like Jim Thome, but even a little bit better. He also put up a 40-30 season at one point so he could steal bases, and his 1994 MVP season is legitimately one of the greatest hitting seasons of all time. At 5, Jimmy Fox. If you think Jeff Bagwell's stats are pretty ridiculous, you gotta look at Jimmy Fox. He won 3 MVP awards and had a ridiculous 609 career slugging percentage. Though he played a long time ago, he was so incredibly dominant, I still think he's a top 5 first baseman of all time. In the 4th spot, Miguel Cabrera. Undoubtedly one of the best hitters in recent memory. He won 2 MVP awards and also was the first player to win the Triple Crown since the 1960s. He also finished his career in extremely rare company with a 300 batting average with over 500 home runs and over 3,000 hits. Ahead of him at 3, though, I have Frank Thomas. I'm going to read off his stats through his age 29 season. He had a 330 career batting average with a 452 career on base percentage and a 600 career slugging percentage. Good for a 182 OPS plus. And that's over 8 seasons. And while he didn't quite maintain that level of dominance over his entire career, at his peak, he was one of the greatest hitters ever, which is why he was top 8 in MVP for 7 straight years, including winning back-to-back. Deciding between 1 and 2 was very difficult. Ultimately, though, I went with Lou Gehrig at 2. And while his career was ultimately cut short, he has some of the most impressive numbers in the history of the sport. He was also a winner. He was a part of 7 World Series winning teams. But in the 1 spot, I'm going with Albert Pujols. Albert Pujols finished his career with over 700 home runs, over 3,000 hits, won 3 MVP awards, won 2 World Series, and for the first 10 seasons of his career, he finished top 10 in MVP voting every single one of them. And then in year 11, when he had a down season, he still finished 5th in MVP voting. Next, we move on to second base. At 10, Craig Biggio. He's a member of the 3,000 hit club. He also stole a lot of bases. He hit for a little bit of power. He also had a really impressive peak. The only reason he's not higher on this list is because from age 33 onward, he was just okay. At 9 and 8, we have a couple of really old-time players. At 9, Nap Lajoie. He actually even played a little bit in the 1800s. But undoubtedly, if you look at his stats, he was one of the best players of his day. And his 426 batting average in 1901 is one of the highest batting averages ever. Right ahead of him, Eddie Collins at 8. He had over 3,000 hits and 742 career stolen bases. And he was a part of 6 World Series winning teams. In the 7th spot, Robinson Cano. Now, because he had 2 positive PED tests during his career, I don't even know if he's ever going to make the Hall of Fame. But if you just look at his stats for what they were, he was a Hall of Fame second baseman. His career 335 home runs are the second most ever by a second baseman. And during the vast majority of his career, he was right up there in discussion for best second baseman in the game. At 6, Ryan Sandberg. It's very close between him and number 5 on my list, but he was an all-time great defensive second baseman while also being a very good hitter, which is also what I'd say about number 5, Roberto Alomar. They also both stole a lot of bases, with Alomar almost getting to 500 during his career. I put Alomar just ahead of Sandberg because I think he was a little bit better as a hitter, but it's very close. At 4, Jackie Robinson. Not only was Jackie Robinson one of the most important players in the history of baseball, he was also a great player. He didn't play in MLB till his age 28 season, yet he still accumulated nearly a 64 career WAR. To put in perspective how impressive this is, Roberto Alomar played 6 more seasons and yet put up a very comparable WAR. And while on-base percentage wasn't talked about as much at the time, Jackie Robinson's career on-base percentage was .410, one of the highest ever for someone at the position. As a player, I think Jackie Robinson was statistically underrated. At 3, Rod Carew, one of the absolute greatest hitters ever at hitting for batting average. His 1977 MVP season is ridiculous to look at. He batted .388 with 239 hits. And in his career, he won 7 batting titles. Not to mention he stole 353 bases. But there was another second baseman playing at a similar time that I think was even better. And that would be at number 2, Joe Morgan. While Joe Morgan didn't have nearly as high of a career batting average as Rod Carew, he nearly had the same career on base percentage. Once again, choosing between 1 and 2 was very difficult on this list. Joe Morgan won 2 MVPs during his career, 2 World Series, stole nearly 700 bases, and put up an insane 11 WAR during the 1975 season. But in the number 1 spot, I'm going with Rogers Hornsby. Some of these old school players just put up such ridiculous stats where I had to consider them toward the top of these lists. And Rogers Hornsby was no exception, because statistically, he was putting up numbers similar to Babe Ruth, or maybe Ty Cobb, I don't even know. Like, combining the two of them together, these stats are ridiculous. During the 1920s, an average Rogers-Hornsby season looked like this. A 383 batting average with 25 home runs and 115 RBIs with a 460 on-base percentage. He batted over 400 3 times during his career, including a 400 season with 42 home runs. I don't know if he should be ranked number 1, but when you consider the fact that second basemen in general are usually not great hitters, and Rogers-Hornsby is one of the greatest hitters ever statistically, it's hard not to put him at number 1. Moving on to third base. In the 10th spot, Nolan Arenado. If Nolan Arenado retired today, I think he'd be a top 10 greatest third baseman. He's undoubtedly one of the greatest defensive third basemen of all time, and he's been a pretty solid hitter. Just ahead of him at number 9, Scott Rowland. Scott Rowland was also an all-time great defensive third baseman, and he hit pretty similar to Nolan Arenado, but he put up even more counting stats. In the 8th spot, a player with a very similar career to Scott Rowland was Ron Santo. You could really go either way between him and Scott Rowland. I ultimately picked Ron Santo a little bit higher because he had more MVP finishes, so I feel like he was a bit more dominant during his day. That's very close. 300 plus home runs with great defense. In the 7th spot, Brooks Robinson. Now I know some people are going to see this and think that this is way too low. Brooks Robinson might be the greatest defensive third baseman of all time. I understand that. At the time of his retirement, he clearly was, but in comparison to the other hitters in this list, he was nothing special. So him making the top 10 purely because he was an all-time great defensive third baseman. But still, he wasn't a bad hitter, which is why I have him all the way up here at 7. Just ahead of him at the 6th spot, Eddie Matthews. One of the earlier members of the 500 home run club, he also put up a nearly 100 career WAR. He had a career 143 OPS plus, meaning he was one of the best hitters of his day. At 5, Wade Boggs. From 1982 through 1988, he had a 356 combined batting average. But what's different than him and a lot of other contact hitters, he also walked a lot. So his on-base percentage during that time was 445. So while he wasn't a huge power hitter, he was such an incredible player at getting on base. He won 5 batting titles during his career and finished with over 3,000 hits. At 4, I have Adrian Beltre. He finished with nearly 500 home runs and 3,000 hits. And he was a great defensive third baseman. His offensive numbers in his 30s, though, is really what carried him into the Hall of Fame. Also, a ridiculous 2004 season where he hit 48 home runs was pretty helpful. At 3, Chipper Jones, a member of the 300, 400, 500 club. He also won an MVP during 1999. He was also part of the 1995 Atlanta Braves World Series team. He was undoubtedly one of the greatest switch hitters of all time. At 2, George Brett, one of the all-time great hitting third basemen, including his insane 1980 where he put up a 390 batting average and was a part of the 1985 World Series team. I think it was very close between him and Chipper Jones, but I think George Brett was more in discussion for the best player in MLB at his time. George Brett was even more of a superstar with an even more ridiculous peak. But the number 1 greatest third baseman of all time is clearly Mike Schmidt. When I think about all the great players in MLB history, I think Mike Schmidt is one of the most obvious players to be the greatest of all time at their position. He led the league in home runs 8 different times, he won 3 MVPs, and he was one of the greatest defensive third basemen of all time. Next, we've got shortstop. At 10, I'm so glad Alan Trammell is now in the Hall of Fame. Much overdue. Just ahead of him at 9, Archie Vaughn. He had a career 406 on-base percentage, and in just a 14-year career, he put up nearly a 78 WAR. At 8, Robin Yount. 3,000 hits, 2-time MVP. He was pretty good. At 7, Barry Larkin, a great defender who was also good with the bat. Just ahead of him, talking about all-time great defenders, we've got Ozzie Smith. Yeah, he probably is the greatest defensive shortstop of all time. But offensively, he's the worst player on any of these lists. So for anyone who wants to argue and say that Ozzie Smith should be higher than this, if you're a below-average hitter, it's hard to be in the top 5 ever for overall player at any position. You have to be truly special. And Ozzie Smith was truly special defensively, which is why he's ranked this high. At 5, Ernie Banks, a 500 home run hitter who during his peak mostly played shortstop. Pretty hard to come by. Right ahead of him at 4, Hannes Wagner. This is why these types of lists are difficult, because Hannes Wagner played a little bit in the 1800s. But once again, his stats were so ridiculous, he's got to have an appearance on this list. I know a lot of people rank him at number 1. I just have a really tough time ranking a shortstop who played that long ago that high on this list, especially because there's been so many incredible shortstops since then who play great defense and can hit, which includes at number 3, Derek Jeter. Is Derek Jeter overrated? Is he underrated? I don't know. However, I do know one thing for sure, and that's that he's one of the greatest shortstops of all time. He was great in big games. He accumulated a lot of stats. He was very good nearly every season of his career. I think 3 is the perfect spot for him. In the 2 spot, Cal Ripken Jr. Cal Ripken Jr. is basically what you think of as the modern day shortstop. He seemed big for his position at the time, but he hit a bunch of home runs. He was a great hitter. He played pretty good defense too. His peak seasons were also some of the greatest in MLB history. But at 1, I think it's Alex Rodriguez. I know he moved positions halfway through his career, but as a shortstop, he was truly insane. His 162 game pace during just the years that he was a shortstop. A 308 batting average with 44 home runs, with 22 stolen bases, a 382 on base percentage, and a 581 .341 slugging percentage. Good for a 144 OPS plus. For a position that's not known for offense, that is absolutely insane. Now moving on to outfield. I narrowed this down to just 10 outfielders, which made this nearly impossible. The 10th spot, Mike Trout. When you consider how good he has been in his career up to this point, playing against the hardest level of competition the sport has ever seen. He was like the best player almost every year for 10 years. Hard to not include him on this list, even without all the counting stats of the other players. At 9, Ty Cobb. Before Babe Ruth, the greatest player of all time was probably Ty Cobb, which is why at the time of his retirement, he had the highest career batting average, the most hits, a lot of stolen bases. He was basically everything except for a power hitter. At 8, Rickey Henderson. Rickey Henderson is a guy that's difficult to rank, but what I like about him is he was an absolute insane standout at stealing bases. No one else has even gotten to 1,000. He had over 1,400. He also had over a 400 career on base percentage, despite the fact he played 25 years. Maintaining a 400 on base percentage for 25 years is ridiculous. From 1979 through 1993, he averaged 73 stolen bases a year with a 406 on base percentage. When you think about the all-time greatest leadoff hitter, it's hard not to consider Rickey Henderson. At 7, Ken Griffey Jr., an incredible defensive center fielder who also could hit 40 to 50 home runs every year and also steal bases. Basically, the perfect baseball player. Right there in discussion for the best player during the 1990s. If injuries did not derail the second half of his career, he'd be even higher on this list. But at his peak, he was definitely one of the best baseball players ever. Just ahead of him at 6, Mickey Mantle, another all-time great center fielder. Right up there in discussion for the most talented baseball player of all time. Mickey Mantle was incredibly fast, was a 500 home run hitter, won MVP awards, was on World Series winning teams. I mean, he's Mickey Mantle. What else can I say? He's the greatest switch hitter of all time. At 5, Ted Williams. Any conversation about the greatest hitter of all time has to start with Ted Williams. He has the highest career on base percentage. He missed full seasons during the prime of his career and still hit over 500 home runs. Not to mention a ridiculous 344 lifetime batting average, and he should have won a bunch more MVPs than he actually did. At 4, Hank Aaron, 755 career home runs, the 3rd most hits in the history of the sport, and just the most consistent great player the sport has ever seen. Right ahead of him at 3, Willie Mays. And keep in mind, in this top 5, like, you could almost put this in any order. An all-time great defensive center fielder, who's also one of the greatest hitters of all time, who could also steal bases. In terms of just the most well-rounded player in the history of the sport, it's hard not to say Willie Mays. And in the 2 spot, I'm gonna go with Babe Ruth. No matter how long ago he played, his numbers are truly incredible, especially if you want to consider the fact he was also a great pitcher. He revolutionized power hitting, but he was also just a great hitter in general. But at 1, I think it's Barry Bonds. When you just look at how insane Barry Bonds' stats are, he did things that no one else did. A 7-time MVP, and if you look at his peak stats through 2004, they're very similar to Babe Ruth, but also added in the fact he averaged over 20 stolen bases a year and was a great defensive outfielder, and he did it in much more modern times. Yeah, did he have a little extra help? Probably. There's never been anyone better. And last but not least, we've got relief pitching and then starting pitching. Starting with relief pitching. In the 10th spot, Lee Smith. Took him a while to get in the Hall of Fame, but he's got some of the most saves of all time, and he was one of the best closers of his day. At 9, Bruce Sutter. Kind of one of the more original, traditional closers. During his day, he was one of the best closers. At 8, Craig Kimbrell. Peak Craig Kimbrell was awesome. And one of the most overlooked aspects of Craig Kimbrell's career is that he's really been a good closer for a long time. Like, maybe he's not pitching like his Atlanta Braves days, but he has over 400 career saves. And his 170 career ERA plus puts him in elite company. Undoubtedly, when he retires, he should go in the Hall of Fame. In the 7th spot, Raleigh Fingers. Raleigh Fingers is one of the top relievers in the game at a time where relievers were pitching multiple innings. And at his best, he was one of the greatest relief pitchers of all time. At 6, Goose Gossage. A lot like Raleigh Fingers, where he would throw multiple innings, but I think his peak was even better. At 5, Hoyt Wilhelm. Kind of the relief pitcher that started it all. At the time of his retirement, he was the all-time saves leader, and he helped establish what we think of as closers today. At 4, Dennis Eckersley. A pitcher that's kind of hard to rank because he was also a very good starting pitcher before he was ever a closer, but as a closer, he was one of the best closers of his day, and he had one of the all-time great seasons as a closer. In 1990, where he posted a 6.03 ERA plus. At 3, Billy Wagner. At the time of this recording, he's not in the Hall of Fame, but he absolutely should be. He is one of the greatest relief pitchers in the history of the sport. I mean, you talk about dominance, he had a 187 career ERA plus. During his day, maybe he was overshadowed a little bit because there just so happened to be a couple of other awesome closers, but in the history of the game, there are not many better relief pitchers than Billy Wagner, especially left-handed relief pitchers. In fact, I don't think there are any. I think he's the best ever. At 2, Trevor Hoffman, first pitcher ever to get to 500 saves, and also one of 2 members of the 600 save club. He was one of the most reliable closers the game's ever seen, putting up 14 30-plus save seasons. But at 1, super obvious, it's Mariano Rivera. There was no easy easier number one on any of these lists. He completely dominated at limiting runs. He also saved the most games of all time. And last but not least, the most difficult list probably, starting pitching. There's some surprises here. 10, Cy Young. He played the most in the 1800s of any player on this list, but given the fact an award is named after him and he has the most wins of all time, it's hard not to include him. However, at 9, Walter Johnson also played a long time ago, but was way more dominant than Cy Young, led the league in strikeouts 12 times, and truthfully has some of the most absurd stats in the history of the sport. However, with pitchers a long time ago, it's hard for me to rank them as high because the objective wasn't to strike out batters in the same way that it is nowadays. Not to say they didn't try to, but it was a lot more contact oriented back then. Walter Johnson was one of the first true strikeout pitchers. And for pitching, I do like longevity. Okay, here's the surprise. At 8, Nolan Ryan. Now, this is only a surprise because in the past, I never included Nolan Ryan in my top 10. However, I'm a firm believer in changing your mind on things. And while I still think that Nolan Ryan is overrated in a lot of people's eyes who rank him as the greatest pitcher of all time, it is hard to overlook how incredible his longevity was. And also just his sheer dominance. He has the lowest opponent batting average in the history of the sport. He has the lowest hit per 9 in the history of the sport. And obviously, he has the most strikeouts of all time. In terms of just sheer dominance, there was probably no one better. And he is ranked much better in Fangraphs WAR than he is in Baseball Reference WAR. And while I'm still not as big a fan of how many batters he let get on base, he still did have a pretty low career ERA, and his FIP was actually even better than his ERA, which is not something you see very often. So while I think it's very important to limit runs, he definitely helped his team stay in the games by not allowing a lot of big hits. At 7, Tom Seaver. While Nolan Ryan was great during his day, I think Tom Seaver, who played at a similar time, was even better. Better at limiting runs. He also won over 300 games during his career. He won 3 Cy Young Awards, and he also won a World Series with the Mets in 1969. At 6, Sandy Koufax. Sandy Koufax had an insane peak. And as I said, I like longevity, but if you have an insane peak, I think that's just as valuable. At his best, there's been very few pitchers better than Sandy Koufax, as he led the league in ERA his last 5 seasons of his career. And during that time, he put up a combined 195 ERA with a 2.00 FIP and more than a strikeout per inning. During the 1960s, a time where this was totally unheard of, it starts to get really difficult in this top 5. At 5, Greg Maddux. He had insane longevity, and he also won 4 Cy Young Awards in a row. He had insane longevity that led him to 355 career wins, but he also had an insane peak where he won 4 Cy Young Awards in a row. But just ahead of him at 4, I have Clayton Kershaw. Kershaw has the highest career ERA plus of any starting pitcher in the history of the game who's thrown at least 2,500 or more innings. Meaning, adjusted for his era, he's been the best pitcher ever at limiting runs. Not to mention the 3 Cy Young Awards and the World Series win in 2020. He has a career 2.48 ERA. His playoff resume is really the reason I can't put him any higher than 4. This top 3 could go in any order. In fact, I've switched it multiple times. However, I'm going to go with Randy Johnson at 3. A 5-time Cy Young winner who is quite possibly the most dominant strikeout pitcher in the history of the sport. Also won 300 games. Won a World Series MVP. The most intimidating pitcher ever. Just ahead of him, I've gone back and forth, but at 2, I'll go with Roger Clemens. A 7-time Cy Young winner. Because of his association with juice, it's easy to forget just how good he was. Since 1900, Roger Clemens also has the highest Fangraphs WAR of any starting pitcher in history. But at 1, Pedro Martinez, the best peak by any starting pitcher in the history of the sport. From 1997 through 2003, in the heart of the PED era, he put up 118 wins with a 2.20 ERA and a .94 WHIP. Good for a 2.13 ERA plus. Those are my list of the greatest players in the history of MLB. There's so many honorable mentions that I could hand out. I thought I'd put Frank Robinson on the list. I thought about so many different things, but I couldn't do it because there are just too many good players who have played this sport. But if you want to see me do the top 50 greatest players of all time, let me know in the comments. I put together that list too in the process of putting this together. Go baseball.